Thank you, Peter, and thank you to our four panelists, and again, an extra special thank you to Khaled for gamely filling in on very short notice, and we're very happy to have you here. So let's get right into it. We're in a situation now where the last round of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians failed. President Trump has announced that he's very eager to get them going again and that he will be unveiling some sort of peace plan soon. But I don't think we're in a time, for many people, of huge optimism. And so I want to start with Amnon. Amnon, you have very cogently linked the idea of two states to Israel's security and how the two are intertwined. So talk a little bit about why you think the two-state issue really is a security imperative for Israel and what you think Israel should be doing to get there in the current environment.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, CIS was established 3 years ago, so it's a relatively young organization. In our vision, we say that the only viable solution, political and security solution, is the two-state solution in a regional context. So we take all the region all together, and we think that Israel will be better secure by having the so-called two-state solution, but in a broader concept. There is no other solution. And the real question right now, whether there are the conditions to enter or to achieve this solution, or we have to find, as we think, a kind of intermediate plan in order to make sure that in the future, when the condition will be appropriate, we will be able to implement this solution.
Polly, I want to turn to you next. The organization you lead, Darkenu, talks about this idea of a moderate majority inside of Israel. And it links a number of issues, one of which is two states, to a number of other issues that you have data on saying that the majority of Israelis support. Yet, we clearly see a government in Israel that has been there now in one form or another since 2009, in which two states certainly is not at the top of the agenda, in which a majority of the members of the coalition have actually come out against two states publicly. So explain to us, if there is this moderate majority inside of Israel in support of two states, and that's what Israeli people want, how do we keep on ending up in a situation where the government is not reflecting these preferences?
So to all of you who support a two-state solution in the audience, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that the moderate majority, as we call it, in Israel exists, and it supports a two-state solution. So from the right wing, there will be a support for a two-state solution or separation from the Palestinians to maintain Jewish majority in Israel. And from the left wing, you will see support for the two-state solution out of the fear of losing our democracy and sliding into, I would say, an apartheid situation, fear of continuing the occupation and so on. But there is a moderate majority for two-state solution, and we see it constantly in every poll, every research, every focus group, and even when we go door to door and knock on people's houses, even if they live in right-wing neighborhoods, a support for separation from Palestinians to two nation states. I want to even add and say, and I'll surprise you, that about a third of Netanyahu's supporters, the people who voted for him in the last elections, do that assuming that he's a two-stater. So they think that he supports a two-state solution, and he will do that when, the situation presents itself, or when there's a partner. He will do it in a safe and secure way, but that's their assumption about Netanyahu. I will give you an example, and it's an important one. 11 years ago, we had elections in Israel, 2006. I do not know if you remember, but Netanyahu with Likud had 12 seats in that election versus to 30 that he has today. Where did all the Likudniks, the Netanyahu supporters back then in 2006, go then? They went to a more moderate party, Kadima, when they had an alternative. The same person, Ariel Sharon, who did the disengagement just a year before. So Israelis from the moderate majority, left to right, to Likud, supported the disengagement, supported the evacuation of settlements, and they showed that in the 2006 elections when they had an alternative. So to your question, if there's such support for a two-state solution and such moderation in Israel, why do we keep seeing very extreme policies from this government? Why is it such a narrow, right, extreme government? So I would say, first of all, it's because there's a big weakness right now in the center-left camp, or what we call the moderate camp. And so when Netanyahu looks at his 30 seats in the Knesset, wants to repeat this amount of seats for the next elections, he's not afraid to lose his moderate voters, because there's not a good enough alternative in the center-left, or not has been until now. He is afraid to lose the mandates that he gained from the right wing. And for that matter, there's good alternatives if you are a radical right now in Israel. You can vote for Lieberman, you can vote for Bennett in the last elections, you can vote for Eli Yishai. These are very extreme, pro-one state or like semi-annexation, and Netanyahu is fighting with the extreme right wing for that electorate. So you will see him moving very far to the right, and it's a political issue. I don't think it's an ideological issue. So we have a majority in Israel of people who support two states that thinks it's a minority because the government is creating this atmosphere in which settlements are legit and annexation all of a sudden is a interesting idea. And what 2 years ago would have been seen in the public discourse as very, very extreme, now seems very, I don't want to say consensus, but more and more legit. And I'll finish with saying this. This is exactly the time, and I'm going to say an optimistic thing, I hope it's okay. This is exactly the time to fight that public discourse, to fight it with presenting the Israelis with moderate ideas as cool ideas, powerful ideas, sexy ideas again. We are fighting a government that has made everything that we believe in, the values of ours, our agenda, to look at it's not patriotic, not Zionist, but we can change that by awakening the moderate majority, by organizing, by mobilizing to act, by presenting new wording, new discourse to Israel, and for that matter, a leader, no matter where he will come from, that will give a good enough answer to this radical right ideas, if he will not stutter, if he will be powerful, if the agenda will look as coming from the mainstream, from the consensus, from Zionism, can fight these ideas because they're there. The public believes them. Nobody in Israel that is from the moderate majority, I'm talking 70 to 80% of Israelis, will not want to annex the West Bank and see a one-state reality.
Khaled, give us a sense of what's taking place on the Palestinian side. Prime Minister Netanyahu is very adamant in his insistence that Israel does not have a partner on the Palestinian side with President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. To some people, it looks as if there's a mirror image of what's happening on the Israeli side, where if on the Israeli side there's a public that supports two states, but a government that does not seem eager to get there, on the Palestinian side, much of the data seems to indicate that the government still does support two states, but the Palestinian public themselves are starting to move in another direction. So unpack this for us a little bit and give us a sense of where things are moving.
How much time do I have?
As much as you need.
To put it very succinctly, the situation on the Palestinian side is a highly dysfunctional one. You have obviously this division between Hamas and Fatah that is now a decade old, but that is really only one layer of the dysfunction that that I think is now sort of overtaken Palestinian politics, such as they are. the division is, in one sense, a reflection of trends in the region, where you have kind of this broader Arab civil war, if you will, between old guard nationalist forces and Islamist opposition forces. So in that sense, this division is very similar in a lot of ways to what we see in Egypt and elsewhere in the region, to varying degrees, obviously, spanning the entire gamut from political paralysis and resurgent authoritarianism in Egypt to civil war and state collapse in places like Yemen and Syria and elsewhere. So in that sense, it's part of this new normal, I suppose, in the region. But it is, I think, different because it's also an intra-Palestinian. It has obviously indigenous sources, but it also has sources that are reinforced by Israeli policy and even by the peace process in terms of reflecting the priorities of Israel. What I mean by that is, Israel would prefer to treat a group like Hamas as a strictly security issue without any political role, either in Palestinian politics or in the broader diplomatic process. So it's kind of reinforced at the regional level and at the international level, this division. But it's much bigger than the division. In terms of your question about where Palestinians stand now on a two-state solution, the interesting thing is that the West Bank and Gaza, in terms of, if you look at all of the Palestinian constituencies, the diaspora, West Bank versus Gaza, East Jerusalem versus West Bank, so on and so forth, the West Bank and Gaza Palestinian population has been the most supportive of a two-state solution, and they were, even long before the PNC vote in 1988, they were pushing this idea in the 1970s and 80s. And so in that sense, I think there still is very strong support for a two-state solution, but that support is declining. And I think the biggest division is, again, like trends elsewhere in the region, is a generational one. So you have, for example, Mahmoud Abbas's own son is a vocal supporter of a one-state solution. One state for Arabs and Jews between the river and the sea with equal citizenship rights. That's pretty significant given, obviously, who his father is, and I think that's emblematic of the trend in general. But where Palestinians fall on this issue, I think, is the least important in some ways because of the power dynamics. I think what we're seeing is a collapse in the consensus across the board in favor of a two-state solution. We're certainly seeing that in Israel, and I think we're also seeing it here in the United States. The fact that the Republican Party, for example, has dropped any reference to a two-state solution, the fact that the Trump administration won't talk about a two-state solution publicly, I think this is indicative of a broader trend really everywhere, that there is a collapsing consensus around two states.
So that's a good segue into the Trump administration. John, let's talk a little bit about the current administration. They've announced that they're working on this peace plan. President Trump, ever since the early days of the campaign, has talked about this desire to get to the ultimate deal and that he believes it's something he can do. Assess whether you think this is actually doable, and even more so, what the U.S. role should be, whether it makes sense for the U.S. to be diving into this at this point in time, and whether you think it will be successful.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you all for having me here today. So, I think there are a number of important questions that you ask. Let me try to kind of unpack them one at a time. One, I think, is whether we are at a moment of opportunity, and I think there the answer is probably not, at least not at this moment. You've heard a lot about Palestinian divisions, Hamas and Fatah. I mean, we're now marking, despite their announcement of a reconciliation or unity government, we're still 10 years into a conflict that has, I think, only solidified the divisions between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I think confidence on both sides is at an all-time low. I think the Israelis still remember vividly the collapse of the peace process in 2000 and the intifada that lasted through 2005. The Palestinians are obviously frustrated that their status hasn't changed since the optimism of the peace process. And I think more importantly, that you still have two leaders who so thoroughly distrust one another right now in Abbas and Netanyahu that I think the odds of things moving forward right now are extremely low. That said, we now have at least one change in the leadership dynamic, and that is in the election of Donald Trump. Now, I think it's fair to say that the specifics of the Donald Trump peace plan are lacking at this moment. I can say that with some certainty. I think we hear a lot about Jason Greenblatt and his tours of the region, and from what I've heard from a lot of the regional players, there's a lot of admiration for what he's doing. There is a sense that he is sincere in trying to find ways for the two sides to come together. But again, this lack of certainty about the direction of the Trump administration, just even the priorities. I mean, having gone and talked to folks inside the administration in the last several weeks, I can tell you that they're looking at North Korea number one, Iran number two, and then there's kind of everything else. And I think the peace process falls at the bottom of the everything else pile right now. But I will also say this, that there have been many presidents and many smart people who have tried to bring the Palestinians and Israelis together. And they've learned all the ins and outs of the Palestinian demands and the Israeli demands and the security and the borders and refugees. And they've all failed spectacularly. Now you have a guy in office who is, well, how do I put this? He's not encumbered by those specifics. And I have to say, there's something almost refreshing about it in the sense that, for all the other people that have failed and have been so bogged down with these specifics, maybe you need somebody who can just say, look, you do this, come together, we're signing this next week. And I think that there is a certain element of that to Trump's approach, at least thus far, that he just wants to get a deal done without necessarily being involved in all the specifics. And I'll just end with this note, that all of this, I think, is an exercise in futility without one key element, and that is American strength, American power. That out of all the times that we've tried to bring the Palestinians and Israelis together, it was the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the United States had just won the Cold War, however fleeting that was, and that we had also just won the 1991 Gulf War, that we had demonstrated real strength. And that was something that was respected across the Middle East. The Arabs were willing to help bring the Palestinians to the table. The Israelis were in awe of their number one ally and protector in the Middle East. And so I think, and you heard this from Prince Turki Al Faisal today, that he was alarmed at the withdrawal of America from the Middle East, that the relative lack of power was unsettling to the Saudis. I don't know whether we get that power back under this administration, but I do believe that we need to start to get a very unruly world under control before I think we can go back to the Middle East and start setting out the terms of a peace agreement.
Amnon, I'd love to get your response to that and your thoughts on the Trump administration and whether you think these guys are going to succeed where everyone else has failed.
Couple of months ago, I was a bit optimistic that President Trump will come with a kind of, not the ultimate deal, but a kind of plan. And as time passes, I'm less optimistic. I wish I will be mistaken, but the miracle will not come from President Trump. Now, right now, I see some negative signs. When the government of Israel is planning to expand 3,000 new homes, 1,000, when somebody, a Knesset member from the coalition, and the government is going to discuss it, is going to abandon the disengagement law to enable settlers to move once again to northern Samaria, to settlements which were evacuated back in 2005. I'm watching the atmosphere, and I get some negative signs. So I think that we should be practical. We can discuss and see the two-state solution as a vision. It's that the ultimate goal, that we want to be there. But it's already years and years, and to those who speak about the status quo, there is no status quo. Things are getting worse and worse. Therefore, instead of dreaming on the two-state solution, we came with a kind of intermediate plan called Security First. And the most important objective of this plan is to preserve the future condition for the two-state solution. Now, it's a very comprehensive plan. It deals with security measures, civil economic measures, political statements. It's a plan which was presented not only in Israel, but here as well. But it's not a plan that can be marketed to the Israeli public. Therefore, we've joined forces, Darkenu and CIS. And what we ask, or with what message we approach the Israeli public, is just one word: separation. Most of the Israelis, they support separation. They don't want to be a part of one state. They want to be separated. It's a Zionist dream. They don't care about the Palestinians. And we have to think about Israel and the Israelis. What is good for the Israeli? From an Israeli point of view. And the only thing that we are working now and we are focusing now with the Israeli public is separation. The best separation that can be achieved. And it is translated to a lot of various activities that are detailed in our plan. In the meantime, as was mentioned, in 2 weeks' time we have the Rabin rally on his 22nd year of his assassination. And once again, we joined forces with Darkenu. And our main message to the Israeli public and to our American brothers, unification. We have to keep Israel and the Jewish world unified. It is the best security measure that can be reached. Thank you.
Polly, you lead a grassroots Israeli organization, and we're sitting here in an American synagogue, with a room full of Americans. I assume most of whom are American Jews. What role should the U.S. and American Jews have in any of this? If change needs to come from within and on the Israeli side, what can American Jews do, or even what should American Jews be doing to change the calculus over in Israel?
In the past 2 years, I've started to appear on television panels, and the best advice I got was, it doesn't matter what you're asked, you just answer your question, or whatever you want to answer, right? So I'm going to start with what I want to say, and then I'm going to go to your question. I was just being honest, right? So, I was just hearing what you talked about, and I want to say I agree with what you said, Jonathan, and I don't think that there is a lot that we can do about the American side, and right now there's not a lot that we can do about the trends that Amnon described, and I don't even presume to affect everything that is happening on the Palestinian side. But we can try and affect public opinion in Israel. And I want to tell you what we're fighting the most, and I think it will surprise you. Israelis just don't care. Okay, it's not at the top of their list. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a big issue in Israel. And so for that matter, when Trump comes to Israel, I was very skeptical. He wants to get a deal, yeah, whatever. We were using his visit to Israel to just raise awareness again to the issue. And we ran a very big campaign, and it says, Israel says yes to separation from Palestinians. So Israel says yes to this Trump's initiative. And you can call us naive. We weren't expecting, this to be a breakthrough, but we were using this, and this campaign was magnificent because, first of all, it got people to talk about separation, and as Amnon said, that is the word both of our organizations is leading right now because it's appealing to Israelis. So again, raising awareness, changing opinion. We got 8% of the people who answered our poll saying, it made us think, it made us change our opinion on separation. And so for that matter, we are just right now fighting for awareness. And what Darkenu is doing, we now have 250,000 people on our database and a very, very strong Facebook page. And we're trying to release as many video clips, a website with information, just bombard Israelis with emotional messages and facts, and just so they are more aware and more active. Because right now, when you ask them, as I said, they are pro-two states, but will they act on it? Will they mobilize and organize around that? No, because they, as you said, they don't see any development in the future. Now to your question. I was asked that before today, and I have a slightly provocative answer. I think that a lot of Israelis feel right now that they're seeing in Jewish community in America a lot of opposition towards Israel. And since, we are less and less willing to get criticism even from within, then more than that from the outside. And criticism as a whole in Israel is not taking very well. I'll tell you a short story. In a focus group we did with right-wingers, we showed them a billboard just to test what they will feel that says, Netanyahu is weak in front of terror. And they said, yes, he's absolutely weak in front of terror. So we said, okay, that will make a good billboard then. He said, no. You can't post that. You can't say that. Because then the Arabs will know he's weak, and that will weaken Israel. So that's how mindsets in Israel work. You cannot criticize Israel outside because it weakens Israel. And so the way that the moderate Jewish community in the United States needs to be involved with Israel is tone down the criticism, that's my personal opinion, and more advising, more empathy, understanding that the Israelis will listen more and bring down their psychological barriers to criticism if it comes in another way. And just one last story, if you don't mind. I told that before today, so sorry if anyone heard me say that. I was invited to the J Street conference. I'm sorry about that. That was a few months ago in Washington, and I went. And I was speaking in a panel. But before my panel, there was a speech by Bernie Sanders, which was accepted there with, you know, like a rock star. I don't need to tell you. Like 3,000 people in the crowd, most of them young. Like 11 standing ovations, really. And he gave a speech about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I heard it was his first one. And they all loved it. They thought it was brilliant. And I hated it. Like, it was painful for me. And the reason I hated it, and I said that on my panel, because it was after the speech, is that everything he said was true. The criticism was all true. He talked about occupation and roadblocks and the responsibility of the Israeli government, and I agree with all of that, right? But he didn't say anything, not even one word, about the Palestinians' responsibility for the conflict, about the incitement, about the terror, about, you know, the opportunities they miss every time. Nothing. It was like they didn't even exist. For that matter, it was even a little bit condescending. I mean, it's two sides here. It's not one, you know, victim and one oppressor. It's more complicated than that. Show the complexity. And so to you, I say, I think it's very important for the moderate majority of the Jewish community of America to show that it sees both sides, that it understands and empathizes the side of Israel, that it brings a tone down the criticism and more of a hug. And then I think Israelis will be much more willing to hear your advocation for a two-state solution as an advice that comes from family, from, you know, from our side, and not as an attack that comes from, you know, someone that doesn't understand how Israelis feel in the midst of this conflict. Tell me later.
It's okay. There'll be time for questions soon. John, I'd like to follow up on that last point with you. You know, you are in addition to many things, an expert on Palestinian politics, and you have worked on terrorism financing with the Treasury Department. And you know, I think Israelis look at what happened in the last 2 weeks, and they see emerging Fatah-Hamas unity deal. And in many ways, I think they reflect something Polly was saying, right? Where there's a lot of excitement in some quarters over a unity deal, but Israelis look at it and say, well, Hamas is an entity that is designated by Israel and the U.S. as a terrorist group. They haven't accepted Israel's right to exist yet. So, you know, what should the approach be? Is this something that should be welcomed and a unity deal? And do Israelis are they correct in looking at this and thinking that sort of everyone's out to get them?
So, look, first of all, it's incredibly important that the Palestinians come together. I mean, I wrote a book about this subject almost 10 years ago. It's available on Amazon.com, by the way. And nothing's really changed. What we've seen actually since the internecine conflict of 2007, it was, I mean, look, let's just call it, it's a civil war, leading to two separate mini-states, Palestinian mini-states, which has created a dynamic that makes it almost impossible for a two-state solution. I mean, really, if you think about it, you've got West Bankistan and Hamasistan and Israel. It's a three-state solution right now, and that's really not much of a solution at all. You've got two different governments, two different economic systems, two different education systems, two different sources of financing. As my friend Aaron David Miller says, it's the Noah's Ark of the Palestinians. You've got two of everything. As I like to say, the two sides really can't agree on the color of hummus right now. And it's just gotten to the point where it's hard to imagine moving forward. In other words, regardless of what you think of this Israeli government, you know that it is bestowed with the power to sign a deal with the Palestinian side, and then on the other side, you've got this sort of, chaos. And so it's incredibly important for the two sides to come together. In my view, though, what you need is the two sides to come together under an agreed-upon framework that demilitarizes Hamas, that ensures that its ideology is no longer welcomed in Palestinian society, the destruction of the State of Israel, the sort of anti-Semitic trends that you see throughout its founding charter. All of these things, I mean, look, at the end of the day, the conflict itself is an incredibly important one because it's about what happens to the Palestinians moving forward. I mean, we had a civil war in this country. It was incredibly consequential in terms of the way that we now see ourselves as a society. The Israelis even had something like this with the Al-Talena, right? If you remember, there was a sort of a radical faction fighting against a more moderate one, and this effectively helped to forge the modern Israeli state. We need this conflict, but the problem is that it's very much getting in the way of everything else right now. It's getting in the way of the solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so it's why I continue to say that I think we need this conflict solved first. And I think that the unity government, as it's been portrayed now, still leaves a lot of very uneasy, unanswered questions about what happens to Hamas moving forward. Now, as for the Israelis, if you'll note, it was really interesting that for the first week or so, the Israelis didn't weigh in on this announcement. Maybe because every time there's been a unity deal announced, it's like Lucy in the football. Everybody thinks it's going to happen, and then and then it falls apart. But also potentially because the Israelis were aware of the fact that the Egyptians were very instrumental in trying to negotiate this. The Emiratis had kind of a quiet hand. And this points to the discussion that we had on this stage just before this panel, that there is this regional architecture that's taking shape, and the Israelis are quietly taking the lead of some of the other Arab countries. And so there may have been sort of a decision on the part of the Israelis to wait and see how this thing shakes out. In my view, though, and the Israelis have now since come out and said, we still oppose a unity deal as long as Hamas is not disarmed and still has this radical ideology. I believe that this deal can't move forward. The Palestinians will once again come to a place where they realize that taking another step forward is a red line for both Abbas and Hamas. But what we really need is we need someone. I wrote about this back in January. Jared Kushner needs a wingman was the piece that I wrote for Politico. We need to help try to solve this conflict first. And I do think that the U.S. needs to be engaged, maybe not directly with Hamas, but we need to try to settle this conflict first. And I don't think it's going to happen just because the Egyptians want it or because the Emiratis want it or because Hamas wants to end its isolation. It's deeper than that, and it needs to be solved.
Khaled, I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well, but in addition, I was in Israel and the West Bank last week with an IPF delegation, and we met with a number of high-ranking PA officials, and I was there in January as well, the week after Trump was inaugurated, and the PA frustration at that point was pretty high. I'd say this past week it was even higher, which I didn't think was possible. Can the Palestinians get a fair shake with this administration? And if they conclude that they can't, what should their next steps be?
Very good questions. But before, I'm going to take a page out of your book. Before addressing
this is a good rule. I should have said it at the beginning of the panel. Everybody just, answer what they like.
I mean, a lot's been thrown out on the table here, and I'm going to try to do this as efficiently as I can. But part of the problem, just on the question of Palestinian reconciliation, there's a certain degree of denial, I think, that is happening here. The position of the United States and Israel for the past 10 years has not been welcoming of Palestinian reconciliation. The closest we've gotten, I think, is in 2014 and recently, non-opposition on some level to a Palestinian reconciliation effort. Maybe this administration, I think, has taken it more to heart. at least as in tactical terms. They understand that on some level that continued Palestinian division is destabilizing. We've had how many Gaza wars now as a result of this this division, which Israel has actively encouraged. Let's not pretend that also hasn't been a primary policy of the Israelis, and for the most part either acquiesced in or wholeheartedly supported by the United States. So the notion that we embrace Palestinian unity and reconciliation, I think is simply, it's just simply not the case. But the conditions that we lay out, that Jonathan, for example, has laid out, I think are not entirely realistic. The Israeli conditions of disarming Hamas, I mean, if you disarm Hamas and it's already agreed to not be in the government, then what is Hamas? I mean, it's essentially you're asking Hamas to surrender before the end of the occupation. In which case, if I'm an Israeli, if I can convince Hamas to disarm, and much even more than that, recognize Israel, then what more do I need? If I'm an Israeli leader, am I in a hurry to evacuate tens of thousands of settlers from the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, or to divide Jerusalem? Of course not. Even the most centrist, peace-minded government in Israel is going to have problems with those kinds of actions. And so, by disarming Hamas and recognition, you've essentially achieved Israel's strategic aims, which is normalization and now the elimination of a military threat, in exchange for the ability to participate in normal political life in the Palestinian context. I think that just doesn't, it sort of misreads the power dynamics and the political realities. This, I think this relates also to the question of criticism and pressure. The way forward that you've outlined is exactly what the United States, what the posture of the United States has been for most of the last 20, 25 years, which is, you create positive incentives for Israel, very, very minimal pressure and criticism, and to the extent that there is any pressure in the international community, the United States goes out of its way to block it. And so that has been the formula of the past 2 decades to hug Israel into doing these things that it otherwise would not want to do. And it frankly hasn't worked. If try to imagine, forget about Israelis and Palestinians, and just think of Group A and Group B. If Group A is clearly the stronger party and Group B is clearly the weaker party, you reduce pressure on Group A, the stronger party, and you increase the pressure. You put more conditions and so forth on the weaker party. That's not a recipe for conflict resolution. There is no conflict resolution model like that anywhere on the planet, that you don't pressure the stronger party into doing things and to try to level the playing field somehow between the two sides. There's no comparison in terms of power. And so, frankly, that model hasn't worked. And I would argue that it's actually backfired. It's created a much more dysfunctional and unstable reality. And part of the Palestinian division is reinforced and upheld by the peace process. Every time someone says, quartet conditions, those quartet conditions, if applied to an Israeli government, could never actually be passed.
I just have to say that I do not disagree with you. My answer was about the Jewish community in America, which I think it's kind of like an inner Jewish question, and versus what you just said about the administration, which I do not disagree. So I do think it can become an inner Jewish political problem if the Jewish community organizations go to the administration and tell the administration, put more pressure on Israel. For that matter, if Jewish organizations are the ones pushing for sanctions or for pressure or for anything else, that creates an inner crisis, which we are already facing. And that's what I was referring to, was not referring to the administration. And in that sense, I can understand what you're saying. I don't disagree.
Okay, we could easily continue this, I'm sure, for another hour, but I want to make sure that people in the audience have time for questions. So there are two microphones, one in each aisle. So if you have a question for a panelist, please come and line up at one of the two microphones, and we'll try to get in as many as we can with the time remaining. So let's start on this side. Please just make sure your question is brief, and please make sure that your question is actually a question.
What I've heard all afternoon is the desperate need for... What I've heard all afternoon is the desperate need for communication between both sides, all sides. What I haven't heard is how do we begin this? Whether it's the Jewish community in America that is terribly upset with what's happening in settlements in Israel and the total frustration, or the difficulty of the Palestinians to be able to communicate with Israeli leaders. Where does it begin? Basic lessons on how to begin this dialogue.
Anyone want to take that?
It's a hard one. I want to say that I come from an organization called One Voice that for many, many years spoke in one voice in Israel and in the areas where the Palestinian Authority is. And it became lately very difficult for Israelis and Palestinians to speak in one voice and still be effective in their communities on both sides. So for that matter, it's important for us to say that we're Zionists and we are choosing a two-state solution from a Zionist point of view. That will hurt the effectiveness and the ability to work of the movement on the other side that is called One Voice and supposed to speak in one voice. And so today we work in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority, doing amazing work, I think, very, very effective, very big. The movements are now doing mind-changing for real, just because we are not speaking in one voice anymore. So I agree with you that communications are very important. I'm answering from the grassroots and work in the field perspective, that today I think the most important thing is that each society makes sure that the majority in each society has a loud voice, is very effective, becomes bigger, powerful, and doesn't stay at home and just see how the extremists are running the show. That would be my answer.
Over here, please.
It may seem that way, but Netanyahu has not been prime minister forever. There were center-left governments that did try to make peace with the Palestinians. There was Ehud Barak. No one would mistake him for right-wing. There was Ehud Omer. No one would mistake him for right-wing. So where was the peace? Where was the other partner? And the last time I checked, there is no so-called occupation in Gaza. And there is still no peace with Hamas in Gaza.
I'll take the second part of the questioner's question first. There's a sort of an implicit assumption in your question, and that is I don't agree that there isn't an occupation in Gaza, and the United Nations doesn't agree either. The legal definition is one of effective control, but let's...
Sir,
we'll set
please let him answer.
We'll set that aside. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the occupation has ended in Gaza and Hamas is essentially a sovereign power in the Gaza Strip, which I don't agree with, but let's just say that it is. Hamas is a national Palestinian movement. It's not a Gazan movement, and to the extent that it supports resistance, or for that matter, to the extent that the Mahmoud Abbas's leadership pursues negotiations, it doesn't do it on behalf of West Bankers and or Gazans, but on behalf of all Palestinians. And that's part of the problem, is that they have these very different visions of what is in the interest of all Palestinians. And so even if Hamas even if we accept the premise that Hamas is effectively sovereign in Gaza, the occupation in the West Bank hasn't ended. And so the rationale for Hamas's resistance, or Hamas's, or even for Abbas's diplomacy, didn't end. And so, I mean, in the same way, I mean, there's a tendency to sort of compartmentalize Palestinians, that, you know, we will make war with one set of Palestinians, and at the same time we have negotiations with a different set of Palestinians. If you were to apply that in the Israeli context, it would be, or any other context, it would be seen as nonsensical. If Mahmoud Abbas decided, I'm going to negotiate only with the Labor Party, and I don't care who's in power or who wins an election, I want to negotiate with, or if Hamas decided, I'm going to negotiate only with those Israelis in southern Israel who are the recipients of rocket fire, for example. You know, Israelis look at it not just in very individual or parochial terms, they look at it as a national issue, and Palestinians do as well.
Amnon, you'd wanted to weigh in?
Just a quick comment. We can criticize the Palestinians, and we can blame them, and we will be right. But we have to ask ourselves, what is good for Israel? And if the current conditions are not ripe enough, what Israel can and should do. And it's only one thing that it can do by itself, without the need of a Palestinian partner, and it is separation. Separation, separation, no annexation.
Over here, please.
Taking into account that the two-state solution is the objective at hand, and also that the issue with applying pressure in the wrong direction as far as the conflict mediation strategy, of course, make no objective sense. How do you then take that, looking at the real security issues on the ground, considering that the PA and Hamas, or likely the PA and certainly Hamas's charter, doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist? How do you then, as Israel needing security, turn around and apply pressure in the way that would normally make sense, applying the pressure to the big guy and not the small guy, and achieve the security objectives?
Anyone want to take that? I think the question, as I understood it, was how can Israel achieve its security objective under the current conditions on the Palestinian side?
I mean, my answer would be that it can't. You need a coherent, unitary Palestinian actor, one who can reasonably claim to represent at least you know, a broad spectrum of Palestinian constituencies, and we don't have that. And I would say it's not only that that Hamas isn't that, but even Mahmoud Abbas's leadership isn't that. And I think this goes also to the previous questions. One reason why the Olmert offer couldn't have been accepted was because Mahmoud Abbas had just lost the civil war. And 18 months before that had lost an election. And so he had just lost Gaza, 40% of the population of the occupied territories. And here he was thrown in the context of negotiations where he was supposed to accept these existential kinds of concessions to Israel. He had no mandate, essentially, to negotiate anything. I mean, we all understand that a weak Israeli leader whose coalition is tottering doesn't have a mandate necessarily to accept these concessions, but you know, the same also applies to Palestinians. And it's also the reason why Mahmoud Abbas couldn't, why he was essentially silent in the last negotiations in 2013 and 14, and couldn't give a response because he was paralyzed by his own weakness.
John, I'm going to quickly give you the last word.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would just say this, that if what you're trying to do is to put pressure on Israel as the stronger actor, and by the way, I mean, yes, when you look at the two, there's one stronger actor and there's one weaker one, but at the end of the day, the Israelis are not exactly without vulnerabilities. I mean, you look around at everything else that they see right now, and they see a lot of scary things. They see an armed-up Hamas. They see Hezbollah with 180,000 rockets, or whatever the current number is. They see an Iran that is pursuing an incredibly aggressive regional strategy, and no, has not given up on its nuclear weapons program yet. You've got to start to take a look at all of those things if you want to start to put pressure on the Israelis. In other words, release some of the pressure on some of these other regional issues and make it so that, hey, look, you really don't have much to lose here if you make a concession in this one specific area. Because it is a smaller concession from Israel's perspective. It's just that they have so many other things that we're dealing with. And again, this gets me back to one of the original points I made here, is we've got to start to demonstrate some leadership in the region. We need to demonstrate that we're strong in the Middle East, that we're able to defeat some of our common enemies, the enemies of both Israel and the United States. You do that, and then I think you can have an easier time getting back to the table and demanding concessions from the Israelis.
All right. Unfortunately, we were out of time, but please join me in giving a big thank you to our illustrious panelists.